A small Spartan boy, no older than 7, stands trembling in the torchlit courtyard as older youths surround him with blank, discipline-hardened faces. His head is shaved, his tunic thin, and yet the real chill comes from the silence. The kind of silence that tells him he is not here to learn, but to survive. Long before a Spartan ever lifted a spear, he first had to survive the boys who came before him. Not Persians, not Athenians, his own future brothers in arms. Tonight was a test, and in Sparta, tests didn't need to end with everyone still breathing. This hidden courtyard was the first threshold into the world of the Krypteia, Sparta's secret youth corps, where obedience was carved into bone. Fear became a teacher, and violence was not a skill, but an expectation. Forget the heroic myths. This was the Sparta no one celebrated, the brutal initiation of boys who would be shaped into hunters, enforcers, and instruments of the state. A scream breaks the night, and the boy realizes the price of becoming Spartan might be far darker than dying. People imagine Spartan childhood as a heroic boot camp, running drills, learning discipline, training to become fearless warriors. But the reality was far more ruthless, beginning even before a boy learned his own name. Spartan infants were inspected like livestock, lifted into the sun so elders could decide whether they were worth raising. If the baby looked weak, sickly, or simply unfit for the state, he was abandoned at the foot of Mount Taygetos. Those who survived entered a world where affection was rationed, food was intentionally scarce, and the idea of childhood, as we understand it, simply did not exist. Boys grew up watching their parents obey the state without question, learning early that their lives were not their own, they belonged to Sparta. By the time a boy reached 7, he already understood a brutal truth. Survival wasn't guaranteed by age, innocence, or family. It was earned, and the state was always watching, waiting to decide if he deserved to continue existing. In Sparta, turning 7 was not a celebration, but a separation. On that day, boys were taken from their mothers and marched into the agoge, the state-run training system that would shape or break them. There were no farewells, no gentle words of comfort. A boy simply disappeared into a world of hardness, where the elders, not his parents, became his masters. The dormitories were cold and bare, lined with rough bedding pulled from reeds the boys were forced to cut with their own hands. Food was limited by design, ensuring hunger was a constant companion. Discipline came swiftly, delivered with leather straps or wooden rods, teaching each child that pain was a lesson, not a punishment. Friendships formed quickly, not out of affection, but necessity, as every boy learned that the only way to endure the agoge was to harden himself, emotionally, physically, and mentally, until fear no longer showed on his face. From the moment they entered the agoge, Spartan boys were subjected to a relentless regimen designed to strip away comfort and forge endurance. They went barefoot through mud and snow, their thin tunics offering little protection against the cold. Meals were meager, often insufficient, forcing them to scavenge or steal from each other just to survive. Any failure to procure food or obey orders was punished brutally, not for moral failure, but for weakness. Silence was demanded at all times. Speech was a privilege earned only through skill or courage. Nights offered no relief. Boys slept in hard dormitories, muscles aching, stomachs empty, minds alert for the first sign of danger. Pain, hunger, exhaustion, and fear became as natural as breathing, and from it emerged a new kind of Spartan boy, one who could endure almost anything without flinching, and who understood that vulnerability could be fatal. Among the boys who survived the early trials, only a select few were chosen for something far darker than the agoge, the Krypteia, Sparta's secret youth corps. These were not ordinary trainees. They were tested not just for strength, but for cunning, ruthlessness, and the ability to obey without question. Selection was silent and mysterious. One night, a boy might vanish from the barracks, leaving only whispers and speculation behind. The Krypteia trained in shadows, moving outside the city walls, learning stealth, survival, and the art of violence without witnesses. They were groomed to be Sparta's ultimate weapon, not just warriors, but hunters of men, particularly helots, who were considered property of the state. To enter the Krypteia was to step into a world where fear and obedience replaced childhood, and where the line between life and death was determined by the skill and cold-bloodedness of a boy barely into his teens. No Spartan boy could claim true courage without facing the altar of Artemis Orthia. Here, pain became both lesson and spectacle. Boys were tied to a wooden altar while elders and priests observed, armed with whips that cut flesh as easily as they cut fear. The ritual was brutal by design. Some boys bled, some screamed, some collapsed under the lash, but endurance was what mattered. Crying or flinching was shameful. Survival without complaint marked a boy as strong, obedient, and worthy of Sparta. The whipping was not punishment for wrongdoing, but a rite of passage, a public demonstration that the body could be bent without breaking the spirit the state demanded. In the flickering torchlight, the air filled with the smell of blood and sweat, and each boy learned that pain was a tool, fear a teacher, and silence the only shield between life and disgrace. After the daytime trials of hunger and pain, the selected boys of the Krypteia were taken into the wilderness under cover of darkness. There were no guides, no instructors to hold their hands, only shadows, the cold, and the knowledge that failure could be fatal. They learned to move silently across gravel and rocky terrain, to hunt animals with bare hands, to sleep in the open while remaining unseen. Every sound, every footprint, every mistake could betray them to elders, or worse, to the helots they were tasked to terrorize. Nights were long, and the cold cut through thin tunics like a knife, but each challenge was a lesson in endurance and cunning. Fear became a constant companion, and by mastering it, a boy learned the first and most important rule of the Krypteia. Survival required not just strength, but the absolute absence of hesitation. The culmination of Krypteia training came in a test no boy could escape: the taking of life. Each initiate was tasked with hunting helots, the subjugated population of Sparta, often in complete silence and under the cover of night. The first kill was both right and weapon, a way to prove courage, cunning, and obedience simultaneously. Hesitation was punished, failure unforgivable. Some boys faltered, their hands shaking over the dagger, their hearts pounding with terror and revulsion. Others struck with cold efficiency, learning that survival, approval, and advancement required the suppression of fear, guilt, and even compassion. The act was not celebrated, nor whispered of in training halls. It was expected. Through it, the boys crossed a line, shedding the last vestiges of childhood and stepping fully into the darkness that defined Sparta's secret youth cause. Once the first blood was drawn, the chosen boys were often sent away from the city for weeks or months, living alone in forests or abandoned ruins with nothing but their wits and weapons. They were forced to endure hunger, cold, and solitude, facing both animals and the constant threat of discovery by helots or elders. During this isolation, they took oaths to Sparta, pledging loyalty not to family, not to friends, but solely to the state. Every day tested their endurance and their obedience, breaking down fear and forging ruthless cunning. In that silence, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves became a lesson. Every moment of hesitation could mean death. By the time they returned, these boys were no longer children. They were shadows, hardened instruments of Sparta, carrying with them the psychological scars of nights spent learning that survival demanded absolute submission and calculated brutality. During the Krypteia, the boys learned that strength alone was never enough. To survive, they had to become invisible. They moved silently through forests and fields, stepping carefully on twigs, flattening their shadows under moonlight, and listening for the slightest sound that could betray their presence. Hunting became a lesson in patience and precision, catching small animals or tracking helots without leaving a trace. Mistakes were punished, sometimes severely, teaching them that hesitation or carelessness could cost a life. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with the chill of air and the constant tension of unseen eyes, shaping the boys into hunters who could think, move, and strike without fear or hesitation. By the end of these trials, they understood that the shadows themselves were as much a weapon as their blades, and that to be unseen was to survive. The final test of the Krypteia demanded more than stealth or endurance. It demanded blood. Each boy was tasked with hunting a helot, a human considered property of the state, and ending their life. There was no ceremony, no celebration, only the cold weight of a dagger in hand and the knowledge that hesitation could mean death or disgrace. Some boys froze, shaking as the target approached, while others struck with ruthless precision, their hands steady despite the fear gnawing at their insides. This was the ultimate lesson, that obedience and survival required suppressing every trace of compassion, every instinct of mercy. The boy who succeeded was marked not as a child, but as an instrument of Sparta, trained to instill terror and enforce the state's authority without question. From that moment, the line between innocence and cruelty was forever erased. After their first kills, the initiates of the Krypteia lived almost entirely outside the city, moving silently through forests, hills, and abandoned lands. They slept in the open, huddled under sparse coverings, surviving on roots, small animals, and whatever they could steal without being caught. Hunger was constant, cold was relentless, and every rustle of leaves could signal danger. Days blurred into nights filled with tension and the constant demand for vigilance. Violence and stealth became second nature, and the boys who returned to Sparta after these months were transformed, emotionally hardened, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly detached from the world they had left behind. Survival was no longer a skill. It had become an instinct, and fear was a weapon they now wielded as easily as a blade. Some of the most grueling tests were not physical, but psychological. Boys were often isolated for days at a time, left in darkened rooms, hidden caves, or deep forests with no food, no light, and no human contact. The silence was suffocating, the hunger relentless, and the mind became their fiercest adversary. Some lost touch with reality, whispering to shadows or seeing threats where none existed. Others endured, learning to suppress terror and doubt until they became almost unfeeling. These silent trials purged fear from their hearts, leaving them capable of walking into darkness without hesitation, and turning them into weapons trained not just to fight, but to obey the state with unquestioning ruthlessness. The Krypteia was not training for honor or personal glory. It was an instrument of terror. Boys were sent out into the countryside with orders to hunt helots, the subjugated population of Sparta, and kill any who were deemed rebellious or threatening. The killings were random, unpredictable, and designed to instill constant fear in the population. Initiates moved like shadows, striking swiftly and silently, their training allowing them to stalk, kill, and vanish without a trace. It was not just an act of obedience, it was a lesson in absolute power, showing them that the state sanctioned murder as a tool of control, and that those who wielded it without hesitation were the truest Spartans. Each boy returned hardened, carrying the weight of blood, yet the city celebrated only the obedience and effectiveness of the Krypteia, never the trauma that shaped them. After months of hunting, surviving, and enduring the brutal trials of the Krypteia, the boys returned to Sparta, but they were no longer children. Their faces were set, eyes hard, and movements deliberate. Shadows of their former selves. Families barely recognized them, and any trace of innocence had been stripped away. They had become instruments of the state, trained to obey without question, to instill fear and to act with ruthless efficiency. Friendship and family bonds were secondary to loyalty, and the horrors they had endured and committed were rarely spoken of. The city saw disciplined warriors. Behind the masks, however, lived boys who had been forged by starvation, blood, and fear, forever carrying the psychological scars of a society that prized obedience and cruelty above all else. To complete their initiation, the Krypteia boys were often required to demonstrate loyalty through acts that tested both skill and ruthlessness. Some were tasked with capturing or punishing helots who had disobeyed, others with performing brutal tasks under the watchful eyes of elders. These demonstrations were not about learning, they were about proving that fear, obedience, and precision had been fully internalized. Hesitation could mean death or expulsion from the corps. By the time these tests ended, the boys had become instruments of Sparta itself, capable of carrying out violence without question, detached from emotion, and bound to the state by fear, discipline, and blood. The trials left them marked, both in skill and in psyche, a permanent reminder that loyalty in Sparta was earned through suffering and absolute obedience. Those who survived the Krypteia emerged not just as warriors, but as part of a secretive brotherhood. bound together by shared suffering and acts that no one outside Sparta could comprehend. Hunger, pain, isolation, and bloodshed had forged them into a unit far older than their years suggested. Men whose courage had been tested not on the battlefield, but in silence, in shadow, and in acts of sanctioned terror. Among themselves, they communicated without words. Glances, subtle gestures, and the smallest shifts of posture carried meaning. Loyalty was absolute. Trust was earned only through survival, and betrayal was unthinkable. In the city, they were feared by all, helots, fellow Spartans, even elders, because their presence was a living symbol of what obedience and ruthlessness could create. A single initiate walking through the streets was enough to remind the population that Sparta's children were trained to watch, judge, and strike without hesitation. Yet the bond they shared was more than fear. It was forged in suffering, secrecy, and the understanding that only they had endured what the others could not. In that brotherhood, they found a grim solidarity. They were both hunters and ghosts, enforcers of a system that demanded their youth, their innocence, and their morality as payment for the city's power. And while Sparta celebrated strength, the true legacy of this brotherhood lay in the quiet, haunting reminder that power can only be built on the bodies, minds, and souls of those willing, or forced, to endure its cost. Surviving the Krypteia left marks far deeper than scars on skin. The boys returned to Sparta hardened, yes, but their minds carried a weight no sword could measure. Every night, nightmares haunted them. The sting of the whip at Artemis Orthia, the silent forests where they hunted, the terrified eyes of helots frozen before death. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear had trained their bodies, but the mental toll was invisible and relentless. Emotion became a liability. Tenderness, empathy, even curiosity were dangerous. These boys learned that attachment could lead to hesitation, hesitation to failure, and failure to death. Even as adults, they walked with a quiet rigidity, their movements precise, their expressions unreadable. Conversation often faltered. Laughter was rare. Many were haunted by memories they could never share, carrying guilt and numbness like heavy cloaks. Among themselves, in the secret brotherhood, they could release fragments of fear and sorrow. But outside, society saw only soldiers, ruthless, disciplined, and utterly obedient. The strongest warriors were often the most broken, their skill inseparable from trauma. Every act of violence they committed, every ounce of pain they endured, left a permanent imprint on their psyche, proving that Sparta's strength was not built on triumph alone, but on the quiet destruction of its children's humanity. As Sparta's power waned, the harsh rituals of the Krypteia grew even more extreme. Elders pushed boys harder, demanding feats of endurance and violence that once would have been unimaginable, believing the city's survival depended on producing ever stronger warriors. Yet the system began to break down under its own cruelty. Some boys could not withstand the isolation and bloodshed. Others returned as shells of themselves, their obedience intact, but their minds fractured. The very institution designed to secure Sparta's dominance now threatened it, producing warriors who were skilled killers but psychologically damaged, unable to function in society beyond the shadows. The state's obsession with control and terror revealed its cost. Even the mightiest army could be weakened by the unseen suffering of its children. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Krypteia was not just training. It was a mechanism of control, fear, and psychological manipulation. Boys who survived were transformed into weapons of the state, their bodies disciplined, their minds conditioned, and their emotions blunted by pain, starvation, and bloodshed. The rituals stripped away childhood, innocence, and compassion, replacing them with obedience, ruthlessness, and silent terror. Sparta celebrated strength and discipline, but the true cost, the invisible scars carried by generations of boys forced to kill, endure, and obey, was seldom acknowledged. These youths became the enforcers of an empire built on fear, a living reminder that the price of power was often paid in blood, suffering, and the broken lives of those society claimed as its own. History remembers Sparta for its warriors, its victories, and its discipline, but the hidden reality of its secret youth corps reveals a far darker legacy.